We are in week 2 of our series, See No Evil, where we've been talking about injustice and evil in the world all around us. And we're going to dive into that a little bit more today, but first I want to ask you a question. As a student, do you ever get annoyed with all the rules that you have to follow? I mean, everybody has a different set of rules to follow, but it's almost always true that there are at least a few of those rules that you hate obeying. I know that's how I was growing up, for sure. But you know what drives me even more crazy is when someone tells me to follow a set of rules that they themselves don't even follow. You know what I mean? Like when you learn how to drive, right, and your parent strictly enforces every law known to mankind, but when they get behind the driver's seat, all their advice goes right out the window. Or when your older sibling tells you to make better decisions, right, but then leaves the house and goes and does something really, really dumb. See, very few things bother me more than someone who judges someone because they do something, but they're secretly doing the exact same thing. There's a word for this, a word for people like this. It's called being a hypocrite. See, hypocrites aren't just annoying, they're actually really ineffective. See, no one wants to listen or obey a hypocrite. And what's even crazier is that most hypocrites don't even realize that they're doing it. So if most hypocrites, right, they don't even realize they're doing it, could it be possible that maybe we're guilty of being a hypocrite as well? Back to the topic of injustice though, when we think about where injustice lies in our world, we always look outwardly. We look for something we can put our finger on and say, yes, that's where the real injustice happens. That's where the real mistakes take place. We point our finger to people like, you know, corrupt leaders or racist people or bullies as the main source of injustice, but we rarely ever look at our own hearts. Now, I'm not saying we're all bullies or corrupt leaders, but I'm saying that it's possible maybe we aren't applying the same standards of living that we place on other people to our own lives. I think when it comes to injustice, we're all a little bit hypocritical and maybe we don't even know it. Look at what Jesus says in Matthew 5, right? He says, "You have heard that our ancestors were told, you must not commit murder. If you commit murder, you are subject to judgment." Right? Obviously, that makes perfect sense to us. That the people who commit murder are a huge source of injustice in this world. Murder's messed up, but people goes on a little bit further and makes things a little bit more interesting. Check this out. He says, "But I say, if you're even angry with someone, you're subject to judgment." Wow, is Jesus really saying that murder and being angry with someone are both equally deserving of judgment? Well, short answer is yes. I mean, I've never murdered anyone, but I've certainly been mad at people and angry with people. And maybe you're mad at someone right now. He says a very similar thing a few verses later. Check this out. He says, "You've heard the commandment that says you must not commit adultery. But I say anyone who even looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery with her in his heart." It's really pretty amazing what Jesus is doing here if you'll catch it. See, he's pointing out the fact that you and I would all be in agreement that murder and adultery are wrong. And it's possible that we would start to judge harshly the people that have done those things, right? But Jesus is saying if you have anger or have thought a lustful thought about someone, you're just as guilty and you're equally as subject to judgment. And that is why we could be considered hypocrites and in need of Jesus' grace and forgiveness. We're so quick to judge someone else, but we tend to overlook our own words, our own choices, our own actions and shortcomings. And Jesus, as he's always so good at doing, is pointing to our hearts rather than our actual actions. You don't have to actually murder someone to be in an unhealthy and sinful place in your heart. Just like God values your relationship more than your rule following, right? It always comes back to where's your heart with Jesus? And sometimes your heart has a tendency to be hypocritical. That's just life. But there's grace for us when we mess up and when we make mistakes. There's grace for that. See, Jesus wants us to get to a place where we can look at the injustice inside of us before we try to nitpick at other people. And he sums it up really well in this verse in Matthew 7. He says, "How can you think of saying to your friend, 'Let me help you get rid of that speck in your eye,' when you can't see past the log in your own eye? Hypocrite. First, get rid of the log in your own eye, then you'll see well enough to deal with the speck in your friend's eye." See, Jesus is simply reiterating what we've already discovered, and that's that the greatest change you can make towards ending injustice in the world starts with you. It starts in your own heart. It's by repeatedly running heart checks to make sure your heart is in a position to love people well. And I'm excited for you to discuss this and some practical ways of figuring this out further in your life groups, which you are now dismissed to go to.